I grew up in Little Italy during the 1970s, when the neighborhood still belonged to men who spoke in whispers and settled disputes with handshakes that meant more than any contract. My father ran numbers for the Genovese family. Nothing big, just enough to keep food on the table and respect in the street. He never talked about the work at home, but I learned to read the signs. The late-night phone calls, the envelopes that appeared and disappeared, the way certain names were never spoken above a whisper. Vincent Gigante was one of those names even then when he was just a soldier climbing the ranks. People called him the Chin, and when they said it, their voices carried a mixture of fear and reverence that I wouldn't understand until years later. When I turned 18, my father brought me to a social club on Sullivan Street, where the old men played cards and drank espresso that could wake the dead. It was there that I first saw Vincent Gigante in person, and I was struck by how normal he seemed. He wore a pressed suit, spoke clearly and intelligently, moved with the confidence of a man who knew his place in the world. This was 1979, years before the bathrobe and the mumbling, when the Chin was still just another made guy with ambition and the backing of powerful friends. He shook my hand that day, looked me in the eye and said, "Your father's a good man." That means something. I felt the weight of that statement, the way it marked me as someone under protection, someone with connections that mattered in a world where connections were everything. My initiation into the family came 2 years later, in a basement ceremony that followed traditions older than America itself. They pricked my finger, burned a holy card in my palm, spoke the words that bound me to silence and loyalty until death. Vincent Gigante was there, one of the sponsors vouching for my character and commitment. By then, he had risen to capo, controlling significant territory in Greenwich Village and the docks. He was sharp, calculating, always 3 steps ahead of whatever game was being played. When he spoke during family meetings, everyone listened. His strategies were complex, his understanding of law enforcement tactics was sophisticated, and his ability to anticipate problems before they materialized was legendary among the made men. There was nothing crazy about Vincent Gigante in those days. He was one of the most mentally acute leaders the family had ever produced. The first time I heard about Liborio Bellomo was during a private conversation between Vincent and my father in the back room of a restaurant on Mulberry Street. They were discussing the future of the family, how the old guard was aging out and new leadership would need to emerge. "Liborio has the mind for this business," Vincent said, "but he needs protection from the attention that comes with the position. The feds are getting smarter, more sophisticated. The old ways of operating aren't going to work much longer." My father nodded, understanding the implications. They were talking about a transition of power that would need to happen in the shadows, away from the surveillance and investigation that had destroyed other families. Even then, Vincent was thinking about how to insulate the next generation of leadership from the heat that came with being at the top. Liborio was different from the typical made guy you'd expect to rise through the ranks. He was quiet, methodical, preferring to work behind the scenes rather than seeking the spotlight that destroyed so many others. While other members flaunted their wealth and power, Liborio lived modestly, drove ordinary cars, avoided the restaurants and social clubs where the FBI cameras were always watching. Vincent saw this discretion as Liborio's greatest asset, but also his greatest vulnerability. "The problem with being invisible," Vincent told me once, "is that when you need to exercise power, people question whether you really have it. Liborio needs someone to be the lightning rod to draw all the attention while he builds the real structure." That someone, it became clear, would be Vincent himself. The transformation began in the mid-1980s, so gradually that most people didn't notice it at first. Vincent started appearing in public looking slightly disheveled, his normally immaculate appearance becoming more casual, more careless. He began speaking more softly during meetings, sometimes seeming distracted or confused, about details that he would have mastered effortlessly before. Family members attributed it to stress, to the increasing pressure from law enforcement that was making everyone more paranoid and cautious. But I was close enough to Vincent to see that it was deliberate, practiced, refined through repetition until it became second nature. He was crafting a persona, building a character that would serve a very specific purpose in the years to come. The bathrobe made its first appearance in 1986, during a period when federal investigations were intensifying across all 5 families. Vincent began wearing it during his walks through the village, shuffling along the sidewalks in slippers and pajamas, mumbling to himself like a homeless person or someone suffering from severe mental illness. Neighbors who had known him for years were shocked by the apparent deterioration. "Poor Chin," they would whisper. The pressure finally got to him. But those of us who knew the truth understood that this was Vincent at his most brilliant, using society's stigma around mental illness as the ultimate camouflage. Who would suspect that a man who couldn't remember to get dressed properly was running one of the most sophisticated criminal organizations in America? The FBI took the bait completely. Their surveillance reports from that period, which I would read years later during my cooperation with federal authorities, described Vincent as clearly mentally impaired and possibly suffering from dementia or other cognitive disorders. Agents watched him shuffle through his neighborhood, speaking to himself, sometimes stopping to stare at nothing for minutes at a time. They documented his visits to psychiatric facilities, his consultations with doctors who diagnosed him with various mental health conditions. What they didn't understand was that Vincent was a consummate performer, and the street of Greenwich Village had become his stage. Every stumble, every confused look, every moment of apparent disorientation was carefully calculated to reinforce the image of a man whose mind had been broken by the pressures of criminal life. While Vincent drew federal attention with his public displays of mental illness, Liborio was quietly consolidating control over the family's operations. He modernized the money laundering systems, established more sophisticated communication networks, and developed relationships with legitimate businesses that could serve as fronts for criminal activities. The beauty of Vincent's strategy was that it created a perfect diversion. While the FBI spent resources trying to determine whether the Chin was competent to stand trial, the real boss was rebuilding the family structure to be more resistant to law enforcement penetration. Liborio operated from the shadows, making decisions that were communicated through multiple layers of intermediaries, ensuring that no direct connection could ever be established between him and any criminal activity. My role in this elaborate deception was to serve as one of the communication links between Vincent and Liborio. On the surface, I was just another soldier following orders from the Chin, but in reality, I was relaying messages between the apparent boss and the actual boss. The system worked through a complex network of coded conversations, symbolic gestures, and intermediary meetings that ensured no direct contact between Vincent and Liborio that could be documented by law enforcement. When Vincent shuffled through the streets in his bathrobe, seeming to mutter randomly to himself, he was actually communicating specific instructions that had been developed through a sophisticated code system. A particular gesture might indicate approval of a proposed operation, while a certain route through the neighborhood could signal the need for additional caution or the postponement of planned activities. The depth of Vincent's commitment to his role was extraordinary. He maintained the charade 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for over a decade. Even during private family gatherings, he stayed in character, speaking in the confused, rambling manner that had become his public persona. Family members who weren't aware of the deception genuinely believed that Vincent was suffering from serious mental illness. His own mother worried about his condition, trying to convince him to seek better medical treatment. The psychological toll of maintaining such an elaborate fiction must have been immense, but Vincent never broke character, never allowed even his closest family members to see through the mask he had created to protect the organization. The legal strategy built around Vincent's apparent mental illness was masterful in its execution. His attorneys, some of the best criminal defense lawyers in New York, presented extensive psychiatric evaluations documenting his deteriorating mental state. Court hearings became theatrical performances where Vincent would appear confused, disoriented, sometimes unable to understand basic questions about his own identity. Federal prosecutors found themselves in the impossible position of trying to prove that a man who couldn't remember his own name was capable of running a sophisticated criminal enterprise. The competency hearings dragged on for years, with expert witnesses debating whether Vincent possessed the mental capacity to understand the charges against him, let alone participate in his own defense. During this period, I watched Liborio transform from a careful behind-the-scenes operator into one of the most effective crime bosses in New York history. He restructured the family's operations to minimize exposure to law enforcement, compartmentalized information so that no single arrest could compromise entire operations, and developed revenue streams that were virtually immune to traditional organized crime investigations. The construction industry, waste management, labor unions, all areas where the Genovese family had historical influence were modernized and professionalized under Liborio's direction, while other families suffered devastating losses from RICO prosecutions and internal betrayals. The Genovese family not only survived but prospered. The irony was perfect. While the FBI spent millions of dollars investigating a man they believed was mentally incompetent, the real target of their investigation was building an empire right under their noses. Liborio's genius was understanding that in an era of sophisticated surveillance and aggressive prosecution, the most powerful position was the one that remained invisible. He learned from the mistakes of flashy bosses like John Gotti, who courted media attention and ultimately destroyed themselves through their own vanity. Instead, Liborio embraced anonymity, allowing Vincent to absorb all the attention while he focused on the business of running a criminal organization in the modern era. The psychological warfare aspect of Vincent's performance extended beyond simple misdirection. By appearing mentally ill, he tapped into deep-seated prejudices within law enforcement and the legal system about the capabilities of people with mental health conditions. Prosecutors and agents who might have been more aggressive in pursuing a seemingly healthy defendant became cautious about appearing to persecute someone who was clearly suffering from serious psychological problems. The optics of putting a man in a bathrobe on trial for complex financial crimes created uncomfortable questions about the justice system's treatment of the mentally ill, questions that most prosecutors preferred to avoid. The code system that Vincent and Liborio developed was more sophisticated than anything I had seen in 20 years of family operations. Simple gestures, the way Vincent tied his bathrobe, the route he took during his daily walks, the timing of his appointments with doctors, all carried specific meanings that could be interpreted by those who understood the system. When Vincent appeared particularly confused or agitated during his public appearances, it often signaled that law enforcement surveillance had intensified and extra caution was needed. When he seemed more coherent, it indicated that conditions were favorable for normal operations. The beauty of the system was that it operated in plain sight, hidden within behavior that appeared random and meaningless to outside observers. I participated in several meetings where the real business of the family was conducted while Vincent maintained his public persona. These sessions would take place in locations that appeared completely innocent: a doctor's office, a church, a senior center, where Vincent's presence seemed natural given his apparent condition. During these meetings, Vincent would continue his act of confusion and disorientation, but those of us who knew the truth could recognize the subtle signals and coded communications that conveyed his actual instructions. It was like watching a master actor perform Shakespeare while simultaneously conducting a board meeting, requiring incredible mental discipline and theatrical skill. The investigation files that I later reviewed during my cooperation with federal authorities revealed the extent to which Vincent's performance had confused and frustrated law enforcement. FBI surveillance teams documented hundreds of hours of apparently meaningless behavior, trying to identify patterns or significance in actions that seemed random and purposeless. Psychological profiles attempted to understand his mental state, while organized crime experts debated whether he retained any real authority within the family structure. Meanwhile, Liborio continued to operate with near-complete immunity, protected by the perfect smokescreen of Vincent's apparent incapacity. The human cost of maintaining this deception was something that most people never considered. Vincent sacrificed his public reputation, his family relationships, and his personal freedom to protect the organization and ensure Liborio's continued leadership. He endured years of humiliation, mockery, and genuine concern from people who believed he was suffering from serious mental illness. The psychological burden of maintaining such an elaborate lie, even in service of a larger strategy, must have been extraordinary. Yet he never wavered, never broke character, never allowed personal considerations to compromise the mission he had undertaken. As the years passed, I began to understand that Vincent's sacrifice went beyond simple organizational loyalty. He genuinely believed that Liborio represented the future of organized crime, a new type of leader who could navigate the changing landscape of law enforcement and legal prosecution. Vincent saw himself as a bridge between the old ways and the new, willing to absorb the attention and scrutiny that would have destroyed a more conventional leader. His apparent madness was actually a form of strategic genius, recognizing that in a world of increasing surveillance and aggressive prosecution, the most valuable commodity was invisibility. The effectiveness of their strategy became clear during the major RICO prosecutions of the 1990s, when other crime families were decimated by federal investigations, while the Genovese family remained largely intact. While bosses from the Gambino, Colombo, and Lucchese families were sentenced to life in prison, Liborio continued to operate freely, his actual role in the organization hidden behind layers of deception and misdirection. The FBI knew that someone was running the Genovese family, but they couldn't identify who it was, because all their attention remained focused on Vincent and his apparent inability to lead anything more complex than a walk to the corner store. The competency hearings became a form of theater that revealed as much about the legal system as it did about Vincent's condition. Prosecutors struggled with the ethical implications of pursuing a man who appeared to be suffering from severe mental illness, while defense attorneys presented expert testimony about the impossibility of a mentally incompetent person running a sophisticated criminal organization. The irony was that both sides were operating from false premises. Vincent wasn't mentally ill, and he wasn't actually running the organization. The real boss remained invisible, protected by assumptions and misdirections that had become accepted truth within law enforcement circles. My decision to cooperate with federal authorities in 1998 was motivated by personal circumstances rather than any disillusionment with the family or its leadership. Vincent's performance had been so successful that even I sometimes forgot it was an act, finding myself genuinely concerned about his apparent deterioration. When I was arrested on unrelated charges and faced the prospect of life in prison, I made the difficult decision to provide information to prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. It was during those debriefing sessions that I revealed the truth about Vincent's condition and Liborio's actual role in running the family. The federal agents who interviewed me initially refused to believe that Vincent's mental illness was fabricated. They had invested too much time and resources in investigations based on the assumption of his incapacity to easily accept that they had been deceived. For over a decade, it took extensive documentation, corroborating evidence from other sources, and detailed explanations of the communication systems before they began to understand the scope and sophistication of the deception. Even then, some agents remained skeptical, finding it difficult to believe that anyone could maintain such an elaborate performance for so many years. When the truth finally emerged during Vincent's trial in 2003, the revelation sent shockwaves through law enforcement and organized crime circles. The man who had been dismissed as a harmless lunatic was revealed to be one of the most sophisticated criminal strategists of his generation. His conviction marked the end of one of the most successful deceptions in organized crime history, but it also represented the beginning of a new understanding of how modern crime bosses could operate in an era of intensive surveillance and aggressive prosecution. Liborio's eventual arrest and conviction years later confirmed what I had told federal authorities about the true power structure within the Genovese family. By the time law enforcement finally identified him as the real boss, he had run the organization for over 2 decades, building it into one of the most profitable and resilient criminal enterprises in America. His success was directly attributable to Vincent's willingness to serve as a decoy, drawing attention and scrutiny, while the actual decision-maker operated in complete anonymity. The legacy of Vincent's performance extends beyond the specific case of the Genovese family. It demonstrated how traditional law enforcement techniques could be defeated through psychological manipulation and strategic deception. Vincent understood that investigators brought certain assumptions and prejudices to their work, and he exploited those weaknesses to create a nearly impenetrable cover for the organization's real operations. His apparent madness was actually a form of strategic brilliance, recognizing that sometimes the best hiding place is in plain sight. Looking back on those years, I'm struck by the complexity of emotions I feel about Vincent and what he accomplished. On one hand, he was a criminal who helped perpetuate an organization responsible for significant harm to individuals and communities. On the other hand, he was an extraordinary performer who sacrificed his personal reputation and freedom to protect others, demonstrating a form of loyalty and commitment that is rare in any context. His willingness to be seen as weak and incompetent in service of a larger strategy required a type of courage that most people could never summon. The relationship between Vincent and Liborio represented a new evolution in organized crime leadership, recognizing that the traditional model of the visible, powerful boss was no longer viable in the modern era. Their partnership demonstrated how criminal organizations could adapt to changing circumstances, using deception and misdirection to maintain operations while avoiding the scrutiny that had destroyed previous generations of crime bosses. It was a strategy born of necessity, but executed with remarkable creativity and discipline. Today, when people remember Vincent Gigante, they often focus on the sensational aspects of his story, the bathrobe, the mumbling, the apparent madness. But those who understood what really happened know that his greatest achievement was not the deception itself, but the protection it provided to others. He sacrificed his own legacy to ensure the continuation of an organization that had been his life's work, demonstrating a form of selflessness that transcended the traditional boundaries of criminal loyalty. The story of Vincent and Liborio also reveals something important about the nature of power itself. Real power often operates invisibly, protected by misdirection and false assumptions. While the public and media focused on the obvious symbols of authority, the actual exercise of power happened in the shadows, guided by someone who deliberately remained unknown and unnoticed. Vincent's apparent weakness was actually a form of strength, creating space for real leadership to function without interference or scrutiny. In the end, Vincent Gigante achieved something that few crime bosses had ever managed. He protected his successor and ensured the survival of his organization while absorbing all the consequences himself. His apparent madness was the ultimate act of sanity, recognizing that in a changing world, the old ways of doing business would lead only to destruction. He chose to be remembered as crazy, rather than allow the family he had devoted his life to building to be destroyed by the attention that came with visible leadership. The truth about Vincent Gigante and Liborio Bellomo represents one of the most sophisticated examples of strategic deception in criminal history. It demonstrated how traditional assumptions about power, leadership, and criminal behavior could be exploited to create nearly perfect protection for ongoing operations. Vincent's willingness to sacrifice his reputation and freedom to protect another man's ability to lead represents a form of loyalty that transcends typical understanding of criminal relationships. When I think about those years now, from the safety of witness protection, I'm amazed by what Vincent accomplished through his performance. He didn't just fool law enforcement, he created an entirely new model for how criminal organizations could operate in the modern era. His apparent madness protected not just Liborio, but an entire network of operations and relationships that might otherwise have been exposed and destroyed. It was perhaps the most successful long-term deception in organized crime history, and its effects continued long after Vincent himself was finally convicted and imprisoned. The final irony is that Vincent's greatest success, protecting Liborio and the organization, was also what ultimately led to his downfall. Once federal authorities understood the true nature of the deception, they were able to build cases that penetrated the protective layers he had created. But by then, Vincent had accomplished his primary objective. He had bought time for the organization to adapt and survive in an increasingly hostile environment. His sacrifice had served its purpose, even though it ultimately cost him his freedom and his life.